Hi, welcome to PhDizzle. I'm your host, Alice Chang, and today we are interviewing Dr. Shirae Leslie-Udofa, who has her BS in chemistry, her master's in biomedical engineering, her PhD in biomedical engineering from VCU, and is currently an associate at McKinsey, based in New Jersey.
Thanks for having me, Alice.
Of course, Shirae. It's so great to catch up with you because we were in the same lab at Georgia Tech and VCU. So it's nice to see you after all these years.
Mm-hmm.
To see you're doing well, and I'm so happy that you decided to do this interview with me. Let's take a step back and talk about chemistry and why you were interested in chemistry in the first place.
Oh, sure. So my love for chemistry stemmed from back in my childhood days and becoming familiar with a Jamaican chemist who was working on oral-based vaccines. And the whole idea here was in other countries where, it may be a little bit difficult to do the traditional vaccine subcutaneously, then you'd be able to just give a drop in the mouth and vaccinate a certain population. And that to me was pretty interesting. So this is like a glucose-based vaccine. I decided I would read a chemistry book that we actually had at home. The cover, I vividly remember, was like multiple funnels, but like different color liquids coming from the funnels. And that was just always in my mind. So with that, as I went to undergrad, I decided to study chemistry, and then I was in love with organic chemistry. So that definitely was a highlight of my undergrad days. And then I realized that by studying chemistry, although I wouldn't be a doctor, I would be able to actually have this type of an impact on population by extending lifespans. So that was really the crux of studying chemistry in undergrad.
And then you decided to go on and get your PhD, but it was in biomedical engineering. So tell me how that happened.
Sure. So again, always having a passion for healthcare, I realized that I could have an impact on patients' lives, not just by the bedside with being a doctor, but also influencing whether it's treatment plan or the instrument that's used with the patient. And so that was one of the reasons why I went towards biomedical engineering, because then I could create something that can be later on used in the medical industry.
And you ended up at Georgia Tech Emory, right?
Yes.
So tell me, okay, and I'm preempting something because we were in the same lab. So you ended up moving, but tell me what happened at Georgia Tech Emory and then what brought you to VCU?
Okay, so I guess I'll take a step back and probably talk about how I even got to Georgia Tech. At the time in undergrad, in my junior going on being a senior, I got a letter from Georgia Tech and I was like, why would they be just inviting me to their school? I haven't heard of them at that time.
Yeah,
I hadn't heard of Georgia Tech, being a Jamaican. They invited me to visit their school and I thought this was some sort of weird school. So I said, you know what? The school sounds familiar. Let me take it to one of my professors. And she said, oh no, this is actually legit. And I said, really? How would they find my name? How did they get this information? I'm like, are they going to kidnap me? She said, no. So I actually flew in and, visited the school and finished the application. And then I got accepted into Georgia Tech. So that was my story into Georgia Tech. In terms of both Georgia Tech and VCU now, I started my PhD at Georgia Tech in biomedical engineering. And then our advisor decided to move schools. But while I was at Georgia Tech, starting my PhD, the problem I was solving was not solved by a fellow graduate student and a postdoc. And it took me 3 years to crack that problem. And so having cracked it, and then, learning of my advisor wanting to switch schools, it was very hard for me to remain at Georgia Tech. having put in all that work, and then having to start over if I was going to stay at Georgia Tech for a new thesis.
Exactly.
So I decided to move with my wonderful advisor to VCU to complete that project, which I'm happy I did. And having gone to VCU, I finished most of my coursework in biomedical engineering. So I didn't want to repeat that at VCU. So I decided to branch out to chemical engineering and, learn far more than just biomedical engineering.
So tell me what you actually worked on. You said you cracked some sort of problem and then you went on to solve that. And if I recall correctly, there was maybe a startup involved as well.
Yes, your memory serves you correctly. All right, so let's take a step back. The actual problem was alginate, which is a hydrogel, right? To get it to dissolve in the body. And so that was the problem that I was able to dissolve. Now, if we focus on the thesis work, this thesis work focused on creating injectable hydrogels to release adipose-derived stem cells for the regeneration of bone and cartilage. So all that means is encapsulating, putting a bunch of stem cells into a hydrogel, into like a small ball, right? And controlling the release of those stem cells from this hydrogel ball into the body, which would then help with the regeneration and repair of bone in the case of a fracture or cartilage in the case of lesions, right? So it could be delivered through an injection at the site that is needed. So that could be as a fracture if it's really needed, or the lesion. So that was the whole idea of the thesis. And then the adipose-derived stem cells are really just stem cells from our fat. And most people, we do have, a decent amount of those. So we thought it'd be good to use those stem cells and push them towards the bone lineage or cartilage lineage.
Did you work on also commercializing that after you solved that problem?
Thanks for reminding me. All right. So, once we're able to crack this problem, there was a startup, like you mentioned, that came out of the project. That startup name was Frangenics. And yes, I was able to be involved with a bit of the commercialization of it. So we got a patent from our hydrogel delivery system. And then from there, we were able to file additional patents and then explore the ability of this delivery system to deliver all other stem cells. So for example, there's a thought that you'll be good in plastic surgeries because there are times where different voids are left in the body, and so you could deliver certain types of cells to help with that. So just a little bit of other things that it could be used for.
So you graduated with your PhD and your master's in chemical engineering, biomedical engineering. Then you left Virginia. I think. Did you leave Virginia? Okay.
I did leave Virginia and I went to New York, never to return to Virginia.
So tell me about, you're at McKinsey now, but there was, a journey to get there. So tell me about like what you did after school, how you transitioned from, the academic environment into your first job.
So right after grad school, I got a internship at a startup in Brooklyn. And that startup focuses on wound healing. And so that was just really something short that I did, but very interesting as well. It was also surrounding a hydrogel, not exactly alginate, but very similar to alginate. And so the whole idea there was, something that you could extrude on the wound site that would stop bleeding.
Okay.
So that was pretty interesting. And then after that, I moved on to working with another startup in Western Massachusetts. And that company at the time was called Flow Design Sonics. However, it was acquired by Merck. And I also got to witness that whole transition, which is pretty cool. The whole idea of this startup is to help with CAR T therapy. And so CAR T therapy is one of the possibly latest therapies approved by FDA for certain types of cancer. And so what it does is that we remove blood from the patient, we get the T cells, and we manipulate the surface of the T cells so that it expresses a CAR. And that CAR now is able to identify or help you to identify certain cancer cells and pretty much get rid of them, right? So there's a bit of manipulation done outside the body. And then once you're able to do that re-engineering, you introduce it to the patient's body. When it goes into the patient's body, it's able to get rid of the cancer. And so my focus there was really helping them with labeling the cells and ensuring that once the separation is done, it was a pretty much pure separation. So you wanted to make sure you had like 99.9% of T cells that are expressing the CAR. And another cool fact about this startup company was they were not separating cells by the typical centrifugation process, or maybe like a magnet, labeling cells with something kind of magnetic and then using a magnet to separate. They were using acoustic waves. So just all these sound waves that you pretty much probably have heard of before, using the sound waves to separate cells, which should be a little bit more gentle on the cells. So that was.
Were you just like singing at the cells?
No. So what happens is, no. So if my memory serves me correctly, what happens is there is two portions. Like, let's say you have two things. Let's say we have a box, and there is a source that produces the wave on this side, and then there's like a transducer and I think a reflector, right? So this transducer sends a wave, like a sinusoidal wave, and then when it comes on the reflector, it goes back. And so just think of those sine waves overlapping. So what happens is it forms nodes, right? And at those nodes, the pressure is zero. So you're able to trap cells there. And so that's how they were able to pretty much separate cells based on density. So again, my focus was like, labeling those cells with various things so that the density would be so much different from unlabeled cells.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So that's a little bit about how they use the acoustic waves to separate cells.
Oh, that's cool. So you guys were acquired by Merck. So did you actually join Merck, or did you leave and then was that your journey into McKinsey?
No. So I actually joined Merck because the acquisition occurred before me starting McKinsey. So like I said, that was also interesting to just see and learn about Merck and why they were interested in acquiring a startup company. They wanted to expand their footprint pretty much into the whole immunotherapy space. And they thought that by purchasing a company like Flow Design Sonics with this new technology, that they had a good shot of doing that. And so I pretty much was with Merck maybe just for a few months before joining McKinsey.
So you worked, from academia, then you went into industry, into like a startup environment, but then you went into a corporate scientific environment, like at a huge company. What's the difference? Like what, a lot of people are like, oh, well, it's fast paced at a startup, or, you're working on bigger problems. Like, what do you think? How is that different from your perspective?
So in all honesty, I wouldn't say that I had enough experience at Merck to really do a great comparison. But from what I could see, touring and just speaking to different people for the little time I had, I would say one of the main differences for me is that you really get your hands on a lot more at a startup company. And so, for my fellow graduate students out there, if there's something that you wanted to explore, like let's say you're not sure about doing something, but you want to explore a bit, I would say the startup is the place to go because it allows you and it gives you that type of a leverage. So for example, I was interested in business development, right? Was I able to do all of their business development at the startup company? No, but they were able to let me in to some of what was going on and how it's done, and probably let me speak here or go to conferences. Whereas at the bigger firm, they probably already have a full-fledged department in business development. So they're not going to take one of their scientists now from R&D and place them there. So I would say that was probably one of the biggest differences that I could see.
So then you made another huge transition. So you're going from, so first of all, you went from academia into industry, a startup into a big pharma. And then I wouldn't say you left, you left the bench, I'll say. And now you have entered into management consulting at McKinsey, which is like the top of the management consulting firms. So tell me how that happened.
It goes back to our grad school days and being a part of that startup company. So I realized, yes, as a scientist, you could do a lot by creating these therapies and, just coming up with different machines or instruments. But it's like a bubble, it's just a bubble if you work on that. You still need to have the impact you want, you still really need to get that therapy out or that device out. And so typically, it's not the scientist that does that, right? You need your person on the business side to do that. And so for me, I thought that was rather interesting and I wanted to learn about it. Because in the future, I never know. I could be, developing my own startup company. So that was really the biggest impulse for me. And then having gone into the startup world and I saw what the business development people were able to do compared to the R&D person. So for example, again, the R&D person, sometimes if you're not asking for these other opportunities, you're really just stuck to the bench.
Yes.
And I didn't want to be just stuck to the bench. If it was my work, I wanted to be going out there, presenting it, talking to the different investors, VCs. I wanted to be a part of that decision making about, what should be the next step for the company with this product? Should we do this? Should we do that? So with that, I thought one of the best ways to get that type of training would be like an MBA on demand, right? So I thought going into management consulting was the perfect fit for that. And I applied to McKinsey and was successful second time around. So that's how I made the transition into management consulting.
That's a great story, and I like how you brought up the point that it actually took you a second time because these firms are so hard to get into, and I also went through the process. And sometimes it's just like if you're lucky, and if the case that you got was a good case, or if your interviewer was a good interviewer, and I think it's a good point to keep sticking with it if you're interested in something. And
definitely. Because I don't know if I mentioned this, but I believe even on my second time around, as I was about to go in and I started like really the first process, unfortunately, my dad transitioned suddenly. Oh. And I wanted to push through, but they were really understanding. And I thought I was stronger than I really was. And so I had to take a pause of a few months before really going back into the whole interview process. So definitely, if it's something you want, I encourage you to stick with it and push through.
And that's another great point about your mental health and your emotional well-being. I think that's starting to be more important now. I mean, I don't know if it's important in grad school anymore, but I know a lot of people who went through grad school is this struggle emotionally and mentally. And I think it's like, hey, it's okay to take care of yourself. You should take care of yourself. And if you're better mentally, you're also better at your job and the other things that you're doing.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. 100%. I agree. Yes.
All right. So you're now at McKinsey. So now tell me about it. Is it great? I mean, what is it like at McKinsey?
So to this day, I've only been there, let's say for a year. Mm-hmm. And to add to that, I've only been there virtually.
Oh, that's fair. Mm-hmm.
That's fair. So in terms of the in-person experience of working on teams, I really have not, gotten that experience. But the things you get exposed to, the lessons you're able to learn, I would say that's really, really great. And just the mindset, of how they frame things, how they approach problems and solving it. That is really good. And then you just meet quite a bit of people. I remember thinking, going back to my, my initial days, and I was like, wow, I won't be able to, grab coffee with people. And I literally was just sending out like random Zoom requests because I'm like, I have to get to know people. And people were really open to, meeting with me, speaking with me, and helping me and supporting me through my journey as I started my tenure there. So that's definitely one of the highlights. And then now that I'm a new mom, they've been pretty supportive in my last days, which was a little bit rougher for me.
All right, since you mentioned it first, you are a new mom, and and you are in a very highly, or what's considered a very highly demanding role at McKinsey. So can you, I know, and it's COVID, so like there's a lot of factors in play here, but how did you manage that process? And I guess as a woman in business or science, you're a first in many things in your area. So how are you managing that? And how do you think that environment is changing for good or for bad for women?
We're in the pandemic, right? And there are a lot of articles that have been released on the fact that quite a bit of women, having to leave the workforce. I reflected on that and I wondered, whether or not I'd be able to continue with my job and career while being this great mom that I envisioned myself to be. I think it's important, that we strike that balance as a woman, as a mom, in terms of, supporting our child and our family, and then going after the career that you want. And to enable that, you really need support, whether it's paid support, like having a nanny, or whether it's relatives, your family supporting you. Because I definitely don't think, as I even think about going back on into McKinsey, that I don't think I'd be able to be successful if I don't have great support. Mm-hmm. So I really do think, as you mentioned, mental health and being in the best space to perform well. I really do think that as women, we step back, not try to take on everything, really get the help that's needed so that you are in the right space to be good for yourself, for your child, and then of course for your job. I have a daughter, so for me, it's also really important to demonstrate, not that I'm the only one that could demonstrate this to her, but I think it's also important to demonstrate to her that, she's able to do these things. And so as I'm doing, what I do in my career, I think that'd be a great example for her as she matures and grows up and become the woman that she will become.
That's great. I am also super emotional now that I'm a mom, but that was so beautiful. I have a son, not a daughter, but I would totally agree with you if I had a daughter, and that's so great. And I love that you think that way. All right, so let's move to something less emotional on the career side. You are still pretty young in your career, but you've done so much. And a lot of people think of McKinsey or management consulting as a stepping stone, but it could also be a career in itself. So, is it too early for you to tell? Are you leaning toward like staying there longer term? Or are you thinking of it more as a stepping stone as well?
So, I'd like to say that every phase in life is a stepping stone. So, because you're learning, right? And those lessons that you learn, you're going to use as a platform to propel you to the next phase. So, I am not sure how long I'll stay, but definitely it's a phase that I'm learning a lot from. I've always had my eyes on startup in the healthcare / medical field. And so it's really for me to identify that problem that I think I could quickly solve before I launch out. I'm not sure what the future holds, but it's definitely an area that I'm learning a lot from. And it could go both ways for me, to be honest with you, because I see other women there with kids going all the way to being a partner. But if something comes across my plate that I'm like, wow, I'm definitely going to launch out and start that company.
That's great. All right, so let's move on to something more fun. You're obviously very busy, and even busier. People, you say you're on maternity leave, but that's not really a leave. It's you're working around the clock with the baby.
24 hours.
Of course. So what are things that get you energized? Do you have hobbies that you like to do or spend, if you had the time, what would you do?
There are different things that I really, really enjoy. Having the time, especially in the summer, going to botanical gardens. I haven't been able to do that with COVID and having a baby, but flowers or plants. So I have an orchid, and this is the second year I have it, and it's now blooming, so I'm excited.
Wow. Do you give it like an ice cube? Is that how you keep it?
No, I don't do ice cube. The one I have is supposed to be like room temperature kind of tepid water,
okay.
A quarter cup of that per week. And so that's what I've been doing.
That's a lot of water. Okay. I keep killing my orchids. I don't know if it's the ice cube. I'm like really bad at, oh my God. I'm like, can I raise a baby? I can't raise plants, but
you are funny. I'm sure you can.
You have
no
a
problem.
Orchid now.
And then the other sort of things, traveling, I picked up a little bit of traveling before COVID too. And then like going to really nice restaurants with great ambiances. I'm really into the ambiance and just how food is plated, because
Do you have a favorite restaurant that you've been to?
Favorite? There was one in Western Massachusetts, an Italian one. I really liked the ambiance there, and they had like a saxophone player in the evenings, and the light was so that was lovely. I haven't been to many restaurants here in Jersey now that we moved. And then there's some charities that I also do. I do have a foundation with another friend from grad school at Georgia Tech.
Oh, amazing.
That focuses on helping children who are in need from the Caribbean. And so there are different things that we focus on based on what's going on in the Caribbean. So for example, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, they recently had a volcano and quite a bit of kids were displaced. So a few weeks ago, that was my major focus in getting them items to the island so that those kids will be able to return to school. It's called Azarae Foundation.
Azarae, does it mean anything? Or is it just a combination of your names?
It's not a combination of our names. But our friend that is also from graduate school, she had gone on a trip. And so one of the little girls that she was helping, her name was Azarae. And so she decided to name it from her. But it also sounds like as a ray of hope.
Oh,
so
yeah. Lovely.
We stuck with the name.
PhDizzle.
Having fun with smart people who do cool things.